welcome to everybody to session 5. We are, of course, grateful to the University of North Carolina, Carolina Global Breastfeeding Institute for all of their help on some of this content and for helping us stay evidence-based and do the research that we don't have the time to do. Do be aware that some of the content in various sessions does belong to UNC. Also in this session, some of the content does belong to Safely Fed Canada. So we've got some great partners with us this week. We're going to express our appreciation to the Marcia Brady Tucker Foundation. Special thanks to Sarah and Weston Perry, the daughters of Elsie Perry, who made a generous donation to support this work, and Baby Bjorn, as well as Breastfeeding Family-Friendly Communities. And we will talk more about our sponsors at the end of the program. So this is session 5. We're in January. We have 6 sessions left. And through those sessions, we'll be going in deeper and really talking about how to implement. Session 5 today, we are talking about congregate spaces, how to create safe spaces and supportive environments that support infant and young child feeding, because it's a little harder to do it in a group setting than it is independently. So today's presenters, we have Norma Escobar and Jodine Chase, and I'm going to hand off to Norma so that she can introduce herself.
Right. Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Melinda. As some of you know, my name is Norma Escobar. I am an IBCLC. I live in the coast of eastern North Carolina in Wilmington. And I was part of the Safe Infant Feeding Emergency Response in Western North Carolina throughout the end of 2024 and the beginning of 2025. I'm also a La Leche League leader and a trained interpreter. It's something that I don't talk about much, but I do a lot of work with a Spanish-speaking community. And I'm very excited. With my work on the coast, I've also been privileged to respond as part of public health. I did 15 years in WIC, and part of our job was to respond to those hurricanes that are common on the east coast of the United States. I am originally from Mexico. So I bring to this a little bit of a bicultural and bilingual worldview as well. So I'm so glad to have my friend Jodine here. So Jodine, please introduce yourself.
Hello, Norma. Thank you. I'm Jodine Chase. And first I want to share that I live and work today on the traditional waters of the Lekwungen people, which are known here in Canada as the Esquimalt and Songhees nations. And these are the modern day representatives and stewards of the land and water in the greater Victoria area. So across the water from where I am, you can't see it, but it's back there is this beautiful point of land, and that is the Palatsis, or Place of Cradles, which is a significant place where Lekwungen parents place their children's outgrown cradles, usually around the first year, in the water for protection and blessings and to ensure a long life. I'm a communications professional. Some of you that are here, I'm seeing people in the chat introduce themselves. I know some of you. It's really great to connect with you in this way. I've had a career focus on issues in crisis communications, and I'm also a longtime breastfeeding and perinatal health advocate. I have worked for many related causes that include advocating for the reestablishment of our milk banks in North America, amending policies and legislation to support and protect breastfeeding rights, and also increasing access to midwifery care in Canada. I'm the co-founder and communications lead for Safely Fed Canada, which is a national, nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that works to protect infants and young children in emergency through safe and appropriate feeding. And in that capacity, I'm also part of the Global Infant Feeding in Emergencies core group, known as the IFE core group. So thank you for having me today.
Thank you so much, Jodine. And now we want to go ahead and introduce our digital support today. Rachel, if you want to introduce yourself briefly.
Sure. My name is Rachel Fan. I am a speech language pathologist and a certified lactation counselor in Central North Carolina. I began working with the SAFE team, right in the immediate aftermath of Hurricane Helene. My family is originally from Western North Carolina. That's where I grew up, and so it was very personal for me to be able to provide that support to my home community. I primarily have worked in infant feeding and early intervention for the majority of my career, and supported the SAFE team primarily as a digital coordinator, tracking all of our work across the region, and also got to spend some time in person on the ground doing some of our support work as well.
Great. Thank you so much, Rachel. I know we definitely appreciate all of your support, not just here, but through all of our work as well. So as you all know, I'm Melinda Delisle. I served as the main boots on the ground coordinator during Hurricane Helene. I have a background in childbirth education, doula work, business, and clinical nutrition. And I'm here as more or less your MC. So let's go ahead and review a little bit about our homework. So let's get this poll launched. So one part of your homework has been to reach out to an organization and try to talk to families. I know we've assigned this a couple of times already, but let's go ahead and talk about how did this go? Answer that poll, because we're trying to figure out where you guys are at this point. All right, looks like we have a bunch of people who haven't been able to reach out. I know holidays really interfere with a lot of everything other than the holidays. And some people have reached out but haven't had any opportunities to talk to families yet. You know, a few that are still planning, and a bunch that went well. So looks like we've given just another moment for anybody else who still wants to respond to that. All right, let's end that poll and we can show the results just real briefly. Let everybody see whichever, no matter what you picked, you are not alone. So we are going to go ahead and continue to ask you to work on trying to talk with families, talk with caregivers, practice that, rapid needs assessment, because it is an important element of doing the response. All right, so now in the chat, if you did have an opportunity to learn a bit about milk sharing in your community, what have you learned? What have you been able to find out? A lot of informal milk sharing on local Facebook groups. Yes, it does not surprise us that you found that. That seems to be a lot of where it happens. People have groups online, they find other people locally and just do this peer-to-peer milk sharing. Yep, relying on Eats on Feets or HM for HB, that sounds like it would be, human milk for human babies. Yes, took me a moment to place that. If you've fallen behind, there's no worries. This is not the kind of course that has a deadline. We're trying to give you assignments in a way that is going to be a little bit easier to understand things in order, to do things in order, hopefully give you time to get to things in between, but whatever happens, if you feel like you've fallen behind, don't give up. Just go back to where you can, even if that's starting where you're at now. So yes, so it looks like everybody's kind of seeing that there is definitely milk sharing, peer-to-peer milk sharing happening in most areas. So you may find that you want to be a little bit tuned into those communities. So as we get started with our main part of the program today, I want to go ahead and remind everybody about some of that trauma-informed care and self-care that we've talked about in previous sessions. Some of today's discussion may be challenging or triggering for some people, so try to be aware of how you're feeling. If you feel like you need to look away from the screen, step away for a few minutes, or, turn off your sound for a little bit and come back to it later, regulate, watch it on the replay when you can pause things and take care of yourself. Do that, all right? There's this kind of work. It's great that we want to help people, and knowing that people are so challenged and that there are these situations, it can be hard for those of us that are helping. So make sure you are taking care of yourself first. Use some of the self-regulation techniques we talk about if needed, and, listen as you can. All right, so let me hand it off to Norma to start with talking about what do we mean by congregate areas.
Thank you so much, Melinda, and everyone that shared their experiences in the chat. Thank you. Thank you very much. My job today is to talk to you about setting the stage, really, for what do we mean by congregate areas? What does that look like? Maybe give you some examples, and then transition, once we talk a little bit about some of the key technical pieces, to hand it over to Jodine to talk to us about a real case study about her experiences in Canada. So let's talk about, what do we mean by these congregate areas? Well, they can look like a tent city. They can look like a shelter, like an official Red Cross shelter. They can also look like informal shelters that are just opened up in churches. They can also look like RV camps. They can look like places where people are distributing goods, like these distribution areas that you see here. There's a picture of me right outside of a distribution area in Asheville. And we were able to identify a lot of families because they were congregating here, sometimes for a long period of time, waiting for supplies. But people in emergencies also go to lots of different kinds of areas. Like there can be communal living in hotels. There could be communal living in somebody's home where maybe several people have been unable to go back to their own home, but they have family members or friends that are opening their home to them. So there's lots of different types of these congregate areas. If you think of anything else, I know I probably missed a few. If you've experienced different ones, please go ahead and put those in the chat. So as we think about these things, let's think through this and think about what are some of the challenges that might happen in these congregate areas of displacement. So I want you to think about it for just a second. Yes, absolutely, Adele. Sanitation can be a problem. Community centers. Yeah. Schools can become shelters, right? And then there's problems with privacy, with illness. Yes. When you get a big group of people are going to be coughing and sneezing. And if they're not washing their hands appropriately, they can become, very quickly these little germ-infested areas that can be a focus of disease, right? There can be clashing cultural community norms, absolutely. Communication barriers, lack of adequate rest, because this is something that we saw in Asheville, actually, that the lights were on all the time. And how are you supposed to sleep when the lights are on all the time? Overcrowding. So just going to show you some of those examples. The long lines, right? The long lines in our area of distribution, and all of these things. So if you look at this particular picture, you can see some of the things that we saw. This is an AI generated image, but it's based on the things I've seen during hurricanes in my area. So what problems do you see? Yes, a lot of the same problems you mentioned, but what else do you see in this picture? Does this parent have anywhere to put things, right? Where the heck is she going to, how is she supposed to keep her children or her child, fed and entertained, and how is she supposed to take care of her own needs, right? How is she exactly? No safe sleeping area, right? And no privacy, right? All these things are things that you can possibly see. So you need to ask yourself, okay, what problems are families facing in my particular area? What can be done, and how can we best approach this? Now, the approach obviously is going to be prevention, but that's not going to always happen or be practical. A lot of times we will be faced with issues daily, like we were in Western North Carolina. Yeah, is there family nearby? Absolutely, Jocelyn. Is her family nearby? We don't see her family nearby. Maybe there are, maybe they're not. So here's another example from different challenges that we see at site. This is a picture from Ukraine. Right here, yes. So these are challenges, right? So privacy, you guys already mentioned that. Resources, where are they getting the resources? Sanitation. Where are they bathing themselves, bathing their children, or washing feeding utensils, right? Communication, a lot of you mentioned that. No heat. That's what I was going for, Marie. Thank you for pointing that out, right? This looks like a garage. What kind of social support? Jocelyn mentioned that. Yeah, air quality, right? Bedding, absolutely. Do they have clean bedding, right? What kind of space is there for a family unit? And what kind of safety does that imply? Is there privacy for breastfeeding? So families have a lot of needs, and they're going to need access to food, to water, to all sorts of different supplies for food preparation and sanitation, and for privacy. No space to de-stress. That is a big one, right? What I saw in some of the hurricane response on the coast when I was working in shelters is you couldn't even go outside for a while because we were waiting for the hurricane to hit and to kind of go through. So the kids couldn't play outside, the parents couldn't go outside, and everyone gets, and the workers couldn't go outside. Everyone's stress level just kind of goes up and up. And the people that are smoking and that are addicted to smoking as a way of coping didn't even have that, because they couldn't do that in the shelter. So why is it important to prioritize needs? I'm going to let you guys fill that blank in. Why do you think it's important to prioritize the needs of these families? Well, yes, absolutely. Human kindness, absolutely. That's safety, right? It allows the mother to continue breastfeeding if she's breastfeeding. It lowers their stress level. It allows them to take care of their children. It safeguards these vulnerable groups. And yes, so let's talk about these vulnerable groups, right? These children and these pregnant people are vulnerable groups. Why are they vulnerable groups? I'll give you a moment to think about it, right? Adele says, babies are more vulnerable. Yes. A baby that's just a few weeks old that gets diarrheal disease in a congregate setting because there's very little sanitation, right? And maybe mom, the lactating parent, was given powder formula and she was breastfeeding, but now she's got this formula. She thinks she's got to use it. So she introduces, but she doesn't have clean water, right? So now this baby has diarrhea. Those babies are at high risk for dehydration, right? Absolutely, Sandra. And if the parent is harmed, so is the child. So these young children, these infants, these lactating parents are the most vulnerable, and they're at risk for irreversible consequences to health. Babies can't wait for the next drop shipment of whatever appropriate food is for them if they're not breastfeeding, right? The meals ready to eat, the military packages that come to many of these relief centers or these shelters are not appropriate foods for toddlers, right? And it becomes really difficult to feed young children where there's not appropriate food. And we also know that interrupting breastfeeding, even for a few hours, can impact that parent's milk supply and can also have severe impacts on the perception of milk supply. It also puts that parent at risk for mastitis. And it deprives infants of the protection that human milk could bring in a crowded setting. So it becomes a recipe for disaster. And of course, we know if the disaster or the emergency becomes long-term, pregnant people that don't get adequate nutrition become at risk for giving birth to low birth weight infants, and of course, preterm deliveries. So yes, so these are families that do absolutely need to be prioritized. We do have a wonderful resource on supporting breastfeeding in shelters. UNC has this wonderful resource that has key messages for relief staff in shelters. We are going to put this as part of your resources when we send out our homework. We're going to go through these one by one. So the first message is for key staff is provide a safe, private area for breastfeeding and expressing milk. Safe can mean lots of things, right? But safe it's going to be a place where a parent can bring an infant and a toddler, and that toddler can roam. There's no electric cords or other dangerous items. If there's toys, it's toys that can be easily sanitized. It needs to be accessible to strollers or other mobility devices. Ideally, it would have supplies for routine baby care, such as diapers and wipes. There should be snacks for toddlers and snacks for the parent. The access to food for the parents, and this is something that can be really challenging. If possible, there needs to be food for those pregnant lactating parents and those toddlers, not just at meal times, at the scheduled times, but throughout the day. We know that pregnant people require snacks throughout the day. We know that toddlers require snacks throughout the day. We know that lactating people are often very hungry. During Florence, I had a parent come to me at 5 a.m. with her 1.5-year-old, and she's like, what do I do? The baby's hungry. And I said, well, the kitchen doesn't open till 7. And that's not an appropriate response. I should have been able to give her something to tide that baby over until the kitchen was open for breakfast. Fortunately, she was breastfeeding, so I was able to give her big props for that and to encourage her that, yes, her breast felt soft because the baby had nursed all night long, but that she still could provide nutrition until the kitchen was open. Identify, who's going to provide that breastfeeding and counseling support. And this does not have to be necessarily someone that's only doing that. Typically what happens is it falls to the medical team, and some people that are in part of the medical team in shelters and congregate areas are can be very knowledgeable, but sometimes they're not. And sometimes they think that supporting breastfeeding means giving someone some formula or a bottle. And so there needs to be an understanding that there are people who know about these things. Now, it can be in the United States, someone in WIC, right? And someone in WIC who happens to, like me, to be working in a shelter in a different capacity, but is a breastfeeding expert. Okay. I happen to be in that position. So I always made sure that I went to the shelter staff and said, hey, if anyone needs breastfeeding support, I'm here. I'm working over there, stashing all the supplies. But if someone needs breastfeeding support, I'm here. So making sure that that we identify those people and that we make sure that the people that are in charge know, right? That there are people in charge. Sometimes it can be a electrolyte leader. Sometimes it can be a nutritionist or a doula. Sometimes you can call the local hospital and get support that way. So there's lots of different ways that this can look. It's not just one size fits all. Okay, so the next section is to post signs that show that breastfeeding is welcome and encouraged. And we'll be sending you some different examples of this, but this next slide will show you just a very simple, breastfeeding babies are welcome here. Now, this signage is wonderful because it provides passive messaging, not just to the lactating parent or family or mother, but to those around them who might not be used to seeing lactation out in the open. And that includes the staff. So this is a message not just to the people or the participants in the shelter, but also for the people working the shelter. Sometimes they need reminders too. And finally, being aware that parents who express their milk for bottle feeding are at special risk, and they require support for bottle feeding hygiene. Breast pumps can become a public health hazard in sheltering situations if they are not properly washed and sanitized. So this is where hand expression and cup feeding become really, really important. And we're going to talk more about hand expression and cup feeding in the next session. Here's another safety poster. I used to carry these with me when I responded to shelters. Do not wash or clean infant feeding supplies here. And we would put that in the bathrooms. But if you're not allowing people to do that, or you're encouraging people not to wash things in the bathroom or in the restrooms, then you need to provide a different spot. And that's where it gets a little sticky. Okay, so this is just a review. This is from the CDC guidance on sheltering and emergencies. Provide family-friendly spaces that offer privacy, skilled and peer infant feeding and nutrition support. We added "and peer" because it's not just skilled. Sometimes it's the peer support that helps too. Access with those for this disabilities or special health needs, and clean and sanitary conditions. Ideally, those spaces should be disinfected and cleaned every 4 to 6 hours. Ask me how often that happens, but we want pie in the sky. Supplies, like I said, for safe feeding, storage, preparation, and cleaning, supplies for routine baby care, easily sanitized toys, and signage in the language spoken in the community. All right, so this is an example that's from the CDC website. We just took a screenshot, right? And they encourage there to be a separate area for diaper changing and for bathing infants, separate area for hand washing. They encourage a place to prepare and clean feeding items and solid foods. They encourage electric outlets for breast pumps and private accessible space for families to use them. They encourage an area with toys for young children and dedicated spaces for feeding. And of course, those spaces need to have safe water, small refrigerator for milk storage, and disinfecting wipes and sanitizer. How often does this happen? Not very often, but this is kind of, if you're ever involved in planning stages, this gives you a framework. They vary. I've yet to see a shelter that looks quite like this, but it's good to dream. We got to dream until we see the reality. So what are some ways that we can create safe spaces for families? We're just going to go through these very quickly. When you have lots of resources, you could have a separate room or partitions or a feeding pod, just like this one. Inexpensive portable tents can also provide spaces for lactation counseling, for milk expression, or for breast or chest feeding. There's a link here, which we'll put in our notes for the homework about the baby tent model. And finally, the last one. This is new. Jodine sent it to me, and I was like, yes, let's talk about this. These blue dot centers. And these were new to me, but UNICEF, in conjunction with a refugee organization, created these blue dot centers or blue dot hubs, and they established safe spaces along key migration routes, specifically from Ukraine to families that were fleeing the war in Ukraine. And it provides displaced family with information, protection services, psychosocial support. So they have access there to clean water, hygiene. It's cold as people are fleeing, so it was heated. They have basic first aid, baby changing stations, charging stations for mobile phones. They had hotspots so that people could communicate with their families. And there was a place for them to register as refugees as they went by. Okay, so this is where I want you to think about how else we can prioritize the needs of pregnant people or caregivers of infants and young children during emergencies. And I want you to think about it related to where you are in your local context. And as you're thinking about it, you don't have to put in the chat if you don't want to, but as you're thinking about it, I'm going to transition over and hand it over to Jodine so she can tell us what they did in Canada when they were faced with an emergency a few years ago.
So earlier I acknowledged the land and waters that I'm on, and I want to say that the land on which these events that I'm going to talk to you about today took place the land is the traditional lands of many First Nations covered in Alberta and Canada by Treaties 6 and 7 and 8. Today, in the face of escalating climate-induced disasters that have been directly impacting all of our communities, it's really important to recognize the disproportionate burden carried by Indigenous peoples. These events that I'm going to talk about today are events that have threatened infrastructure and livelihoods, and also the traditional food sources, cultural practices, intergenerational knowledge transfer. And I want to particularly acknowledge the resilience and strength of the local Indigenous communities that were impacted, including the Mikisew Cree First Nation, the Fort McMurray First Nation, the Chippewa Prairie Dene First Nation, the Fort McMurray First Nation, Fort McMurray 468 First Nation, and the various Métis locals who continue to live and work and lead climate mitigation efforts on these lands. So I'm going to share the story today of an ad hoc coalition that formed to respond to the needs of a community that was displaced during the Fort McMurray wildfire, which I know is very well known in many parts of the world, in May 2016. And I'm mainly going to zoom in on this part of our response that is related to congregate settings. So first, we'll really quickly look at this map just to help orient you to where we are in this disaster. On the right-hand side, you can see blue pins. You can see where many of you are in North Carolina. The top pin is the city of Fort McMurray and the large industrial complex that is our oil sands operations. And this is the area where I grew up. The next pin is the city of Edmonton, which is a city of about 1 million people. It's actually the most northern large city in North America. And this is where I lived for many years. And then this is where most of the congregate areas that we're going to talk about were located. And then when you see that other pin over on the other side of the map, that's where I am currently on the west. So Fort McMurray is a really young city with a very high birth rate. Of the 88,000 people that were evacuated, 3,000 were under the age of 2, and that included about 900 breastfed infants and young children. The local hospital handled at that time about 125 births per month. And so this wildfire came in very quickly and the entire community had to be evacuated. A small group of us were in the middle of planning, ironically, an IYCFE workshop which was a first for our country. And when this evacuation happened, I was literally on the phone with one of those organizers. And she had to basically say, I have to go. I am being evacuated. A wildfire is sweeping into our city. So we knew in our community that there was no IYCFE planning because we were working on planning. And we realized that if we didn't do something, this community would not be impacted. And so within a few hours, we formed a coalition and mounted an ad hoc humanitarian response. The woman in this picture is Sarah Hege. Some of you may know her mother. She is a La Leche League leader, and this was several hours after they fled. When it was safe to stop, they pulled over, and this is where they fed their babies. So the evacuation was intense, and many people had to drive through the wildfire to flee. And a good number of those people felt their lives were in acute danger. And there were no losses of life that day, but the community did lose 2,400 houses, and buildings. This is a map showing the same geography that we just looked at. There is only one highway in and out of the city of Fort McMurray. It runs north of the city to service the oil sands area and then ends in the bush and wilderness. So there's one main road out, and that's to the south. And it's 400 kilometers to the nearest big center. I'll leave others in the chat to translate my non-imperial measurements for you. Most of that drive is through the wilderness. So no one intentionally leaves Fort McMurray for the drive south without a full tank of gas, as the nearest service station is 200 kilometers to the south. About a third of the community drove north, away from the fire, and the rest made their way south. Most people were on the road for many, many hours, and as many as 8 or 12 hours, maybe even some longer. It was a slow crawl on that highway going south. The coalition that was formed was the Breastfeeding Action Committee of Edmonton. That's an advocacy group in my city, La Leche League Canada, the Alberta Breastfeeding Committee, which would be our provincial baby-friendly implementing organization, part of the Breastfeeding Committee for Canada, the Canadian Lactation Consultants Association, and INFAT Canada, which is our national IBFAN group. And while folks were still evacuating, the first thing that we did with our newly formed ad hoc group was to hold a meeting with our city's breastfeeding committee. So that's the committee that's set up as part of the being on the path to baby friendly, which we were at the time. And so this briefing became a really important piece of identifying needs and creating referral systems. I will tell you, we didn't know what we were doing when we did this briefing, but we held this meeting to establish that we were going to do a response, and it really proved to be very important. We also had at that time several Indigenous birth keepers who were involved and active on the board of one of the organizations that was part of our coalition. And these women were really critical to our operation. They have since gone on to form a group which was called Indigenous Birth Alberta, and now it's known as Tehuawasiswagamik. So along the route were reception centers. That's what we call them in Canada. These are registration centers. They offer typically day services, all automatically, and some group shelters are set up depending on the nature of the emergency. The first call to action came from a public health nurse who was on the phone with me when the evacuation came. She texted when she arrived at Lac La Biche. So this was hours after she hung up the phone and fled, and then she texted, and then we got on the phone. And that was the first stop for many people. There were about 4,000 people, and that's kind of the first little house that you see on the map south of the wildfire. Also on that map north of that fire is where some of the areas I will talk about later where people had to shelter when they fled north. So this is an early picture of that reception center. It had already served thousands when this woman arrived, and she wanted me to hear first that they had no facility for breastfeeding. She had encountered one of her clients, an 8-day-old baby, a woman with an 8-day-old baby who was sitting feeding on the toilet seat in a washroom. So she asked us to reach out and ensure that all the reception centers that were being set up were supported to set up breastfeeding spaces. And she said they need a sign right at registration, letting people know that breastfeeding is welcome and that there's a dedicated space available. And although that seemed like a really tall order, I said, yes, I will do that. And then I had to figure out how to make it happen. And we were actually able to have the province's health authority fax signs and instructions to all the facilities. I can't say how many used them. She urgently wished us to know that the formula use in their community at first home visit, which is usually at 3 to 5 days after birth in that area, was 54% of mixed feeding or formula use. And so I think it's important for us to think about how hard it is sometimes to access that public facing data. In this case, this public health unit was on the path to baby friendly, and that data was available on a website. So that was really important for us to be able to access information and accurately, or more accurately predict the IYCFE support needs that were needed. So this is the main reception center that was set up in Edmonton. It's in a facility called the Northlands Expo Center. It was still being used or set up when these first people that you can see here arrived, and it eventually served about 25,000 people. Not everyone stayed overnight. This center is vast. There are many halls that look like this. There are conference halls. This is an ice rink. There were 2,000 people, there were facilities for 2,000 people to stay overnight. And over the course of the several weeks that they were open, they served 66,000 meals. So we created a rapid assessment process for the congregate areas. We visited as many of these places as we could. Folks that went north had additional issues. This is a photo of what work camps look like in this area. They're like big motel complexes. And workers live here. They're flown in and out to work. They have their own airport in the area. They were already in the process of evacuating their workers when people started showing up. Some of these people were housed in camps that were not operating. So we had reports of people turning on the taps and rusty, dirty water running out. There were no supplies or equipment positioned in advance to meet the needs of families or children or infants. There was no triage for families. When people did arrive and found themselves together, most kind of formed their own support groups. People hung out in the lobby, welcomed other families. They shared childcare, they shared food. There was cross nursing as well. Knowing how quickly people had to leave, some people literally left with just what they had in their hands or in their car. Or I have one story of a woman who said to her husband, "You get the snacks," and then they got in the car and he had beer and taco chips. This is where we found the most acute infant feeding challenges in this particular area. The air evacuation of these folks that I referenced in the earlier slide was done through literally hundreds of flights, day and night for a week. Mostly our air carrier WestJet with 737s. I remember being in the airport and standing and looking at the arrival screen, and there was just rows and rows of Firebag WestJet as these flights were coming in. This was a massive operation, and most families were prioritized for these flights out. So meanwhile, all of the people who had driven down were arriving in the city of Edmonton and were facing, as you said, Norma, earlier, really long lines for services. They were needed to register. Then they could access healthcare, food, personal care services, vouchers for nearby services. People who needed lodging, who were prioritized, were signed up for lodging. Registration is the key to accessing services within this system. And at this time, it was always done in person. Since then, there are some online registrations that happen in emergencies in Canada now. So we assessed this. This is a lineup for basic services, toothbrushes and beddings, and we assessed as many of these places as we could. I will tell you, I'm going to go back and look at your comments later because I'm really interested, but I'll get totally down a rabbit hole if I look at them now. So sometimes they're popping up on the screen, but I will actually go back because I think there's some really interesting comments that are being made as I go through this. So here's another area that popped up that provided supports. In Edmonton, officially, our emergency response, their policy is no donations are called for or accepted. And so they procure supplies, but there's an inevitable flow of donations, as we all know. And in order to manage this, they actually directed people to purchase new items. And the first call was for a new pillow and its wrapping. And people lined up by the thousands at the local Costco to buy pillows. There were more specific calls that were made later, but over time, this situation deteriorated. And eventually, our city had to lease 2 airport hangars where they sequestered these goods that were donated that weren't really being used as part of the response. For 2 years with no heat, of course, it's very cold where we are. It's like -40 in the winter some years. And so that freezing cold was necessary because they had to deal with a bed bug infestation before they could address what to do next with these materials. So we produced information sheets initially to distribute. We actually used a model from Australia. We produced these overnight. And we wouldn't do this sheet this way again. We wouldn't use this image this way again, but this is what we produced at the time. We also produced business cards with the 1-800 number, and we distributed those or left these behind anywhere where we assessed the circumstances in the site. So even if we weren't directly communicating with families, we left these behind. As an aside, we found that many of the calls that came into this 1888 number were not just from families, they were from emergency workers, healthcare providers. It wasn't just the public that needed assistance. Responders really knew really quickly, because it was such a large population of families with young children, that they weren't equipped to support this population. It's important to note here that all of these official sites, there were also many informal congregate areas that popped up. Here's a sign for a family by the side of the road that was offering food and showers. So some of the donations that came in, as we went through and started to do assessments and people realized what we were looking for, they started on their own to set aside donations of things that they thought would work for child-friendly spaces. So this is an example of, in the flow of the moment, people understood what was needed after we were there, and they set aside these donations knowing that we might come back, or someone might come back and help them set up a space, or they could set up a space themselves. So many people in that community, and you need to know that in this part of the world, it's still pretty cold. I mean, it was very hot. This wildfire was triggered by a heat wave but overnight it's very cold. And we don't usually start our summer camping season until the long weekend in May, which is the third weekend in May. But many people had their trailers already hooked up in the driveway. They were starting to get ready. People fled with their trailers if they had enough fuel ready and they were ready to go. These folks had a built-in place to stay. Even if they had to pull over to the side of the road, they were relatively well equipped. We did assess some of these sites. We found there were some problems, for example, where temporary sewer hookups were put in place and they might be a little too close to fresh water taps. But in general, this population, this subset was well resourced. So some, though, were in better shape than others. So this family's focus is obviously on fishing and tent camping, and this meant that they weren't quite as well equipped as some of the others, and you can see that they're making the best of it here. So this is a mother with an 8-day-old infant in a camp setup that we encountered during our assessments, and she was doing great. Her feeding situation was fine. She was an experienced breastfeeding mom. She had 3 other children. I think they were 4 under 5, maybe 3 under 4 under 6. So what she needed was continued encouragement and also a reminder to the community around her that this family could need some help, use some help so that she could feed this baby and take care of this young baby. Save the Children was also on site. They were responding at the same time that we were. They were also doing assessments. They were an important partner for us in our work. And I'm just going to put it in a side, Norma, when you mentioned baby baths, Save the Children was at that great big reception center within hours. And one of the things they had was a little trailer, and they supported families to bathe and wash infants and children, which you can imagine after being on the road and fleeing for hours and hours. That was just a really valuable support piece. So we collaborated with them for some of our site assessments, especially in that main reception center, and then in our shared responses. And this is an example of what one of their child-friendly spaces looked like. We were invited to participate within that space, so we were able to conduct feeding assessments. We attended gatherings where families were present that they coordinated. And there was an opportunity here to liaise with other organizations and to have a space for all of us to connect with families who needed resources. And because they were focused on creating these broader child-friendly spaces, and they were in partnership with a number of organizations. So here's their acknowledgement of their partnership with the Canadian Red Cross. They were very pleased to have someone who was willing to provide a specific IYCFE response. So it was a really good partnership. Early on, in fact, for 2 days, Save the Children's response was delayed because they were caught up in the beginnings of what was a major gastro outbreak. It was big enough that it, as you can see here, made the news. It raged through that main reception hall that I showed you, the big one that you saw the photo of. I think this contributed to a decision to send many of the families that were starting to arrive by plane directly to temporary lodging, and they bypassed this in-person facility with registration. In a lot of ways, the gastro, which was really challenging and quite unfortunate, was also a silver lining because this let us get the procurement people to really quickly understand. Once they got that powdered infant formula wasn't sterile in the face of this outbreak, they got it. The health unit was able to confirm that ready to feed single serve with sterile nipples was the only product that they should be making available, and they complied and they removed all of their powdered product. The move to create separate space for infant formula prep happened out of this, bringing food services people in place. We all witnessed families trying to mix bottles in washrooms. What do we call them in the States, Norma? You'll have to tell them. At sinks, adjacent to people that were vomiting and experiencing diarrhea in the stalls. So, and I can see by your face, well, you can just imagine when we went and explained that we saw all of these people making these bottles, I think it was less than an hour and they had a space set up for formula prep. So another really important space to identify, and you talked about it as well, Norma, is, and to assess feeding needs, is in these large lineups. The reception centers, as previously mentioned, had large lineups. In this emergency where there was a cash card distribution, there were actually 2 with thousands of people who needed to receive these cash cards. And so there were these huge lineups. And at this mass distribution of cash cards, we came and we did mother, caregiver, baby and child assessments. So you can see here a mother with a toddler in a stroller. And that's actually a worker there who's identifying her. And she's going to be moved to the front of the line. And the reason that's happening is we had this interesting thing happen where someone in the emergency center understood GBA plus, so gender-based assessments, and they were understanding the need to apply that lens, and they were looking for an opportunity to say, this is why you want to apply this lens. And so this huge lineup with many people who arrived and were in line for hours and hours and hours with these very young children with no facilities at all for food, no way for them. Like, they didn't plan to be there for this long. Allowed them to say, let's find the caregivers of the young children and let's invite them to come to the front of the line. It was marginally successful, but at least there wasn't a consideration as an opportunity here. You'll hear a little bit more about why this became really important when I come back and talk to you again, but I won't talk too much more about this now. In addition to the official lodging, as I mentioned, there were other facilities that were set up by the community. So there's a large population of temporary foreign workers up in the community of Fort McMurray, and many folks come into this region or to this country directly from Muslim countries. They may have not very much English. They may have little or no family support. And in this case, a very well-known mosque in our city, in Edmonton, that is diverse in that it supports people from over 40 different countries that are Muslim. They recognize that these women and children were not feeling safe in this reception center. And so they created an alternate group lodging facility in their mosque. So this is a picture of a local volunteer helping women and children to the mosque facilities. There's a man, he's carrying a car seat, and then there's another child in a stroller. How are we for time? Because I want to tell a tiny little bit more about this if we are good for time. We're good for time. Excellent. So I will share that the city in advance in that big reception center understood and had worked with the community in advance in their planning and understood the need to create prayer spaces for Muslim people and also segregated prayer spaces, which is common in a mosque, so a male prayer space and a female prayer space. And we piggybacked on that and assured them that for the people who were comfortable in those prayer spaces, who were women who were breastfeeding, that would be an additional breastfeeding space. What none of us anticipated, including some of the Muslim community organizers, was that people wouldn't feel safe separating as families, and the women wouldn't feel safe without if they were together, if there was a family unit, they wanted to stay and pray together as family units. And so the prayer spaces were actually underutilized. But at the same time, the community's response in order to create this extra space was happened very quickly, and it was welcomed, and there was no friction around this arrangement, this flexible arrangement. So emergency social services, which is what we call this part of a response in Canada, anticipated the need for strollers and car seats. They were there, which was great, but they didn't anticipate other parenting needs for small children and babies. Our networks, remember talking about that first coordinating meeting that we had, our networks really responded. There was procurement of baby wearing devices. People offered nursing bra fittings because people left with the clothes they had, including the nursing bra they had. They offered other supplies. They raised funds to support this. They came and helped as volunteers in some of our spaces, and the broader community really did a tremendous job of stepping in to help. And some of our best advocates for families were often doulas. Doulas are so used to helping families to get what they need without stepping on the toes of the authorities that are in place. Families themselves were also strong advocates, especially if supported. And so an example of this is I could tell when a baby had been a premature baby, because the fathers would come up to the table where the formula was, and they would insist on a single serve, ready to feed bottle with a sterile nipple for each feed. And some of them even knew that the two brands that we have in Canada, that the nipples aren't interchangeable. And they'd be like, no, I need that one. No, that not the other one. And we supported them. We backed them up. And we made sure that people knew that they're not kidding. They really need a sterile nipple for every single feed. Infant formula, as you saw before, was at, I'm going to say I have in my notes, virtually every congregate space, actually every congregate space. Almost all of it was dropped off by volunteers. And it was generally widely available. So this is that same place that you saw that neat, tidy pile of formula at the beginning of my presentation. This is the same facility in Lac La Biche. This is what it looked like just a few hours later. We did in-site assessments. We cautioned against mass distribution of formula, but that was just a really big, tall hill for us to, and we didn't want to die up there on that hill. So we focused more on supports for individual families, and we let this be. We always explain why it was not a good idea, but we didn't get hung up on trying to change it there. Within, and I see a note in the comments, I'm just going to comment, although that does look very organized, it's actually not the organized in the sense that there are a lot of products there that are inappropriate. No one has sorted them. No one has, there's sorting and organizing to keep it organized, but no one has had the expertise to be able to make sure that these products are safe and appropriate. And I think someone calculated that there was enough formula here to feed every single baby that needed formula in the city of Fort McMurray for about 5 years, just in the Lac La Biche area alone. There was no shortage of infant formula in this area. And even after all of these donations, there were no, like in this particular response, there was no report of stores being sold out because the formula was being donated. So with a third of the population that fled north that I talked about earlier with those flights that came down, those flights came into the big airports in Edmonton and Calgary. And this is a map of Calgary, and you can see the airport on the top right. And then these 4 little houses are 4 university dormitories, which was it was just a convenient place for us to house families. This emergency coincided with the end of university, and so these were empty dormitories and student housing facilities. There was no general registration. People arrived at the airport, they got on a bus, and they went right into these places, and then their registration happened there. This is where site assessment was really helpful. So in one dormitory resident in Calgary, the kitchen, as you can see in this picture, this is a photo from their website. This is what it looked like. They had dishes, they had pots, they had pans, they had everything they needed, really. They might not have had a kettle, but in one of the 2 sites in Edmonton, which was the sister university of this Calgary site, their student residents at the end of every year, everything comes out. So there was not a single piece of cutlery, not a glass to drink water, no pots. And in that particular case, we found ourselves actually running out. We were on site with Save the Children, where they set up a child center, and people came pouring into the site to ask us for help. And we found ourselves phoning and gathering pots and pans and kettles and other supplies to help them prepare their meals. In this site, this is another one of these big residences called Lister Hall, or Lister Center, I guess it's called now. I think there were 1,000 places there for 1,000 beds. This was like more dormitory style, where there was a Congregate, like a cafeteria. So there were no real kitchen facilities in rooms. And we were able to see the cafeteria where meals were being prepared when we did our site assessment. The food services staff were really helpful and immediately set up a place for people to do infant formula prep and a way to clean bottles and teats and sterilize. There were also some complimentary feeding supports. We were able to help the food services staff just basically understand that family meals, table meals were good for most children, and give them some ideas of foods that would be helpful, like, go buy all the bananas and things like that. However, in this particular site, we were actually told there was no formula on site and that no donations were being accepted, but we found this on a return visit. So they had set up a store for people to go and shop with donated goods. And so here, again, the usual problems with donations were here as well. So donations aren't always from well-meaning individuals. On the left, here's a letter from Mead Johnson, which I know is an American company, so I know you know who they are. And they report in this letter to someone who's asked what they're doing to support the families of Fort McMurray. They sent $10,000 in cash to the Red Cross, that they have expedited shipments of infant food products through Food Bank Canada into the region. And we know that many pallets were donated. And on the right is an example of one product that was not widely known or available in our community before this disaster. And we haven't blurred this out because I want you to kind of really understand what I'm talking about here. It's a nutrition product. It's really, in this case, vanilla shake, chocolate milk, strawberry milk with vitamins. We saw families come time and time again. There are major amounts of this in the main reception center and in almost every official reception center. And what we would see is families would come in, and we could tell that they'd been in before because their toddlers would kind of break away. They'd let go of their parents' hand, and they'd run to the table because they wanted more of this delicious drink. And the workers there really felt good about this, handing these over, because everyone was concerned for the young children's nutrition, and they were convinced that this was a solution. So in interviews that we did for a research project, and I think I will have a link for that paper somewhere. Forgive me if I haven't sent that to you, Melinda. We heard people say that their children developed dependencies on these products very quickly. We had one family with several young children who were spending hundreds each month on this product because they could not get their children back into their old diets. This is now a standard product in our region. And you'll see in the next slide here, I recently saw a tent card promoting this product, just like we promote infant formula in some doctor's offices with free samples. This was in a doctor's office. So shifting gears here, we collected pilot data. So I've mentioned that we did these site assessments, and we also did these individual rapid feeding assessments with anyone who was a caregiver for a child that looked like they were under the age of 2. And so we targeted 0 to 24 months, and this was within the first 3 or 4 days of the disaster. And it's the standard question: how old is your baby? What did your baby eat before the fire, before the evacuation? And what is your baby eating now? And you can see in this data that exclusivity, which is the blue part of the pie, went, and this is across from 0 to 24 months, so it's not just 0 to 6 months. Exclusivity went from almost 27% to 16%. Mixed feeding increased as you lose exclusivity, you increase mixed feeding. So it went up from 30.5% to 36%. And then you lose breastfeeding altogether. And so formula use went from 30% to 35%. And there was also an increase in whole milk use. And what that represents actually is people who were putting their babies down at night with bottles, who hadn't had bottles for a while, but they had gone to this place where they needed that comfort. And so they were using whole milk and reporting it in this way. Mainly that's what that represented. So these are very similar numbers to what are seen in many disasters. And this is actually where I'm going to segue now. I'm going to stop talking about this particular adventure that we all embarked on, and you're going to hear some more about the outcomes of this experience. But I'm going to move on now and share a little bit about a second disaster that happened in Fort McMurray a couple of years later. This is a picture of flooding. This was in the midst of the early weeks of COVID. So this is what people might think of as being flash flooding. This is actually a flooding caused by an ice dam. And Fort McMurray is on a confluence of 2 rivers, and where that ice is a river, but all the other area where there's no ice is not a river. That is flooded land. The result was that a third of the town site, I say town site because when I grew up there it was a town, a third of the city had to be evacuated, and more than half of its grocery stores and big box stores and supplies, the Walmart, the Superstore, including its food bank, were flooded. As you'll be able to see from this photo of me, this was when mask wearing was just becoming a mandated requirement. So it was early on. This was my first day actually wearing a mask. Of course, I wasn't working. I'm not a clinician, so I wasn't working every day with people with COVID. We arrived in our own self-contained sleeping and support unit. That's the picture on the left. And we participated as a team member in the emergency social services response. And you'll hear more about how we came to be in this position the next time I talk to you, which is, I think, in session 10, Melinda and Norma. So by now, we'd worked with this community for several years. And here's actually a picture of the baby child unit that came out of some of that work. But because of COVID, this unit was not fully implemented. Because what happened was, instead of coming into this central registration areas where they could be registered and receive services, registration was handled by interviews with people driving up in cars. So the lineups took most of the day and the night to clear. I was able to drive that 400 kilometers from Edmonton to Fort McMurray. And after we deployed and arrived, and most of the people had still not yet been processed. So there were still hundreds and hundreds of people in cars on the highway waiting to be processed. So after they would be interviewed, they would get their basic registration info, and then they would be referred to hotels and work camps. Everyone was sheltered in hotels. Some were sheltered in group lodging, but most people with families were in hotels, or again, those same work camps that we talked about before. And this is a registration page that is the standard registration. You can see on the right some of the questions they asked. So did they have COVID? That seems like a good question. Or did they seem symptomatic? They were asked if they had pets. By this time, there was a whole pet process in place. Medical conditions. And then on the left, you can see someone has made a note. They've identified the ages of the children, and someone has made a note that the baby child unit is going to follow up. But there was so they had this notion that they needed to ask more questions to try to help people get the support they needed, but there was no follow-up. That follow-up that's noted on that page actually did not happen. So what did happen was we were able to follow up in the hotels and motels in the next couple of days. We went door to door. We identified needs. We referred anyone that had feeding needs to public health, and they had a team that was responding, but it was far from ideal. And I think it's important to know that when you have these multiple, a community that's in recovery and then another disaster and disasters that happen at the same time. So in this case with a pandemic, the sum of those adds up to more in terms of burden than each individual one. It becomes cumulative, and it is really challenging for these communities. So this picture here, and the last piece that I want to share with you in my talk today is an interesting outcome of this particular experience. There was an unsanctioned group that set up a large donation center and called for people to bring donations, which of course also happened by car. It was widely publicized, mainly on social media. People went into the remaining stores that were open and purchased diapers and baby wipes and infant formula and drove to the site and waited in cars in line for hours to drop off supplies. And then the volunteers, this is the early on in the place. You can see how much of this is infant formula and infant baby supplies. They became really overwhelmed and they had a lot of difficulty managing these supplies. And then those who were in need for donations drove and then waited in their car lines for hours and hours for these donations. And those that couldn't wait or chose to purchase supplies went to these remaining grocery stores and they found dwindling supplies on the store shelves. Several of the shelves ran out of diapers. So on the left side is one of the signs that the managers put up. These are signs we prepared overnight, and it's hard to see there, but our logo's on there, but also this is from the local public health. The store managers were great. We went into the stores twice a day, all of the available places where you could purchase infant formula, and our job, and this was a pivot, our job was to assess the supplies of infant formula, remembering that this town is 400 kilometers in the middle of nowhere, and you can't just go get supplies from the neighboring community. It takes 24 to 48 hours to organize and bring an extra shipment. The next supplies that were going to come were routine trucks that were already, with orders in place and already on the road. But what we did was we talked to those managers to find out what was coming. We assessed whether or not there was going to be a need for additional supplies. And what you see here on the right is, and we took a very detailed photos, actually I have hundreds of photos because I meticulously photoed each area and then did a wide shot of the photos. So you can see on the right, these are the products that are selling out. You can guess what brand this is, and you probably have figured out, I'll ask the question, can anyone guess what the brand is that's distributed in a local hospital? Right? In fact, Mead Johnson has the contract for infant formula for all of Alberta. So if you go through to the next slide, you'll see that the big picture here shows that although that brand was selling out, and in some places it was bordering on some challenges for some products. In general, there was no shortage. We didn't need to make extra plans, and we had a really good opportunity to communicate to store managers so that they could help their clients understand that brands are interchangeable. And this was a message that public health worked on putting out as well, that if the product they were used to wasn't there, that it was perfectly fine for them to use the next product on the shelf and that there would not be harm that would come to their babies. This is the diaper aisle where there was a diaper shortage. And I think, how are we for time? Because I have one summary slide, but I'll tell a little anecdote if we have time. All right, we're going to go with this. I don't have a photo to show you, but I will tell you something else that ran out. So they were like, this is a town still of 75,000 people, and a third of them were in hotels and not in their homes. And on day 3, one of the places that was completely flooded out was Mark's Work Warehouse. Do you have that in the US? Where that's where you get supplies for, if you're a working person, you go to Mark's and you get your steel toe boots and you get that's where every man in the city of Fort McMurray apparently buys their underwear. On day 3, I don't know what guys are doing, but the women were all washing our panties in the sink, right? And on day 3, there was a crisis. They had to get special permission to send the Mark's Works warehouse people into their place and get all the underwear, because all the other underwear was sold out in all the other towns, because the men on day 3 all needed new underwear. And so there's my story about supply management. And I feel like you've all been very generous, that I think I probably am over time. This is my summary. These are key factors that we think are important in addressing congregate spaces. So Marie says they only changed every 3 days. Like, I don't even know, Marie. There was an uprising. So partnerships were really important. Partnerships in providing these family, child-friendly spaces. The Baby Friendly Initiative, which was just underway, we had no baby-friendly facilities at this time in this area. But the data for that situation was important. And you'll learn later from us that they had some early contact ahead of time before the first disaster, with emergency social services. These in-person assessments where people with babies were, these lineups for cash cards and these distribution centers, this was really an important part of our response. And also being able to hand off a card with that 1-888 line, that was a really important piece. Being able to rapidly assess the sites. So we would go in, make an assessment, bring them all together at the end of the day, make sure we wrote the name of the facility at the top, because if we didn't, we couldn't remember what we were talking about by the end of the day. But that really helped us to really quickly assess need and to make sure we had relevant supports every time we returned. So signage, hotlines, resource posters, cards, those referral mechanisms, which again, because of that orienting meeting that we had with our community, became really important there too. And then finally, flexibility in meeting people where they're at, working with people's strengths. So we realized really early on that food services people understand food hygiene and food safety, and they were the people to talk to about formula safely. And then we also realized that, in one case, I remember the facilities manager in his regular job, he ran the zoo. And so my colleague that day, who was Fiona Langsharp, I know lots of you know Fiona right away, she's like, well, you know how important it is to keep mothers and babies together. And absolutely, he knew that. And within like half an hour, he had created this special space within the larger cafeteria area where people with young children could come and they could feed their children. So it's that piece where you find that one point of commonality. And that's what you talk about in that moment. You don't try to give them everything they need to do. You just figure out this person is going to understand this piece, and they're now going to be a champion and advocate for this one piece. So I will stop there.
All right. Thank you so much, Jodine. It's been wonderful to have you here. And thank you for sharing those stories. And they're so impactful. And we will be getting into a lot of what you do to try to prepare for these kinds of things, how we can work with sites and help them to either be prepared for it in advance or to work with trying to make adaptations, during a disaster response in future sessions, including session 10, when we have Jodine back to share some more of their wonderful expertise. So we're going to take a moment, and I need to thank our sponsors who are so generous. Thank you to Baby Bjorn, who is a family-owned company proudly manufacturing baby carriers and other baby gear specifically designed for safety, comfort, and ease of use since 1961. And we also want to thank the Marcia Brady Tucker Foundation, who is the organization that had the initial grant that got this training program started. Without them, we would not be doing this training at all. Thanking Sarah and Weston Perry for their generous donation in memory of Elsie Perry. She was a founding mother of La Leche League Boston in the 1960s and had an impact on so many parents and their babies over the decades that she served. We want to thank Breastfeeding Family Friendly Communities, who provides technical assistance to breastfeeding coalitions and health departments across the U.S., including Breastfeed Durham, Breastfeeding Family Friendly Communities of Asheville, and the North Carolina Breastfeeding Coalition. The SAFE team, one of the newest projects, revealed national gaps in infant and young child feeding during emergencies. Our core mission of systems change uses the 10 steps to a breastfeeding family-friendly community to train and educate non-lactating community members to better welcome families, normalize breastfeeding, and prepare for safe infant feeding in emergencies. Together, we build environments where every family can thrive. Confident Pregnancy, also called Melinda Delisle Innovations, helps people be healthier, feel more confident, and find their inner strength so we can show up as our best selves. And you can sign up for information at melindadelisle.substack.com. And finally, but definitely no less than any of the others, is the Birthstone Center for Appalachian Perinatal Resilience, who strengthens perinatal health in Western North Carolina by centering families, uplifting birth workers, and advancing equitable access to lactation, doula, and maternal mental health support, building resilience in mountain communities before, during, and after birth. Starting as a small private practice, Birthstone has grown into a regional nonprofit that creates innovative solutions, providing a village for mountain families. We have a very exciting announcement in that we are restarting our Safe Support and Strategic Core meetings. These are ongoing quarterly meetings for activists and advocates of infant and young child feeding in emergencies who want to get together, work on skills, strategize, brainstorm, talk about what is happening as you try to implement a lot of these things we've talked about in your own communities. Our next session we resume on February 3rd. At this same time, please register if you want to be able to attend. Real briefly, I'll mention the homework. We're going to have you look at creating or adapting your own signs to use in congregate areas. Start learning a little bit more about your community preparedness. Reach out, find out how they respond, how they currently treat IYCFE if you don't already know those things. And try to get out and do a little bit more experience with caregivers, even if that means asking some people to go ahead and help you by doing some role playing. We've got a bunch of handouts that you will get, and I want to encourage you, remind you to do your evaluations again, because we do look at those. They do help. Thank you for all the comments that you leave there. And we do request and appreciate, obviously it's optional, but if you can, please go ahead and support this work. And so now let's come into getting the questions. So I want to, it looks like a couple people have restated their questions from earlier. So one question, yeah.
Jodine's been gracious enough to go through the chat and answer some of those questions, but for the sake of the recording, I would love to get Jodine to answer at least two of them, specifically the flyers that you showed. The question was, why would you change it, or how would you change it? What was wrong with that?
Yes. It was mainly the image. We wouldn't use that image again for the following reasons. It was, as Adele pointed out, that's a more of a dominant culture image. And I didn't mention, but I will say that most of the people we were serving were people who were in community spaces because they didn't have family or friends. And there was quite an intersection of people of color, people who were newcomers to Canada. So it was really that was a misstep on our part in not recognizing that need right away. But also that's a breastfeeding image, and people either didn't see themselves in that image for a variety of reasons, or people who are providers and supporters didn't see their perception of who they were helping. That image didn't help them to understand what was needed. So we wouldn't use that image again, and I'm happy to elaborate on that. If anyone wants to email me and get a really detailed explanation of how we got there and what we do now, I'm happy to talk about that. My emails are open for people, or however you can reach me on various socials. What other question, Norma, do you want me to answer?
The other one I wanted to make sure that you answered, because I think this is a really critical one. I know we're going to be covering it in session 10, which is in June, which seems so far away right now. But was how did you ensure that the Save the Children effort and your efforts weren't being duplicated?
We had no idea how to ensure that. We didn't even really realize we needed to ensure that, because we were working on our small group of people even a city of 1 million people. You kind of know each other and you work together. But Save the Children, these were experienced disaster and emergency responders, and they knew how to make sure that we weren't duplicating effort. They were very good. They were good communicators. They understood their need. They understood what we were going to do, and they were very clear. We will do this, and you will do that, and we will both do what we are doing to the best of our ability. They were a good model for us immediately and down the road. I mean, we learned a lot from working with people who normally are working in low and middle income countries, but had that skill set.
Yes. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And I think you answered a lot of those questions in the chat. So thank you. Some of them were specific to transportation and things like that. I do see a request for putting the QR code. I'm assuming it's for the Safe, Support, and Strategic Core group. This is a very informal group. I hope you all sign up for it, because this is a time where we don't have a lot of scripted activities. It's you telling us what you need and us helping you brainstorm. We don't have all the answers, right? Because every context is unique. But we will help you maybe know who to go to for answers or find more information. That's our hope and our joy, and to really be there for each other. It's more of a community of practice where we're all trying to figure it out together. You don't have to do this alone.
And I will add, we are going to put that registration link and the QR code into the homework and that follow-up email that you'll get in the next day or two. Do you have both of you have a couple of minutes to stay and answer a few questions, Norma and Jodine? So one of the questions I'm seeing, I haven't gone through all of the chat yet, but I know you answered a number of them. And that is, was the phone number that you used during the response set up just for the emergency response? Who hosted it and who fielded those calls?
We set that up specifically during this response. So my partner at Safely Fed Canada, Michelle Pensabranco, was the logistics support person from afar during this. So she was in her home, which is near Toronto. And that's one of the things she did very quickly. But we didn't just set up a phone. Well, I mean, she got the phone number. We weren't even sure if we were going to use it. And then we had some experience working as a team with some of our people had worked in the European refugee migration crisis. And we wanted to make sure that we could staff the phone line with people that could handle emergency related requests. And beyond breastfeeding support, we knew we needed people to be able to handle broader infant and young child feeding. So we created like a little mini instant. You had to have completed these little training modules that were available at the time. And then you needed to be an IBCLC. So we narrowed the field for who we recruited. So we actually recruited. That was the Canadian Lactation Consultants Association was really helpful. You could also be a La Leche League leader, but you needed to have those more formal skills as well as your La Leche League counseling skills. And the phone number, Michelle managed the staffing of it. She took the calls, typically did intake on the calls, and then we would get a phone number and she would assign and someone would phone back, unless she could handle the call herself, but that was typically how she did it. She also collected a series of resources from where people were when they were calling. So right away, first it was Edmonton and Calgary, so local Alberta resources, but this disaster diaspora was very big because people come into Fort McMurray from other places all around Canada and the world. So people really quickly flew back to their home places, but their infant feeding needs didn't stop. And they might have that card still, or they may have seen the number on social media. So she was able to gather resources from Newfoundland, where a lot of people that are in the oil sands up there are Newfoundlanders who fly in and out, and their families are in Newfoundland. And then the final question, I'm sorry, you asked the last question. I'm not sure if I'm answering this, but I will tell you that we kept that phone number and we spun that up through several emergency responses, but we actually, Safely Fed doesn't do response anymore. We work almost exclusively in guidance and policy now.
Some people are wondering, oh no, it looks like you answered that, talking about the different lines for different kinds of health needs. So
I would like to touch on something Adele mentioned. I did answer in the chat, but I'd like to touch on this a little more because I think it's really important.
Mm-hmm.
Different responses happen differently, but it's really common for these organized responses to be segregated in types of need: registration, housing, food. Health and medical is often a segregated need. And where I think there's a huge gap is within emergency responders areas, like the emergency response. They tend to think of infant feeding needs. If the parent can't handle this, then it's a medical need, it's a health need. And they think, well, the doctors, the nurses are going to be able to handle this. And so there isn't a lot of preparation on site for that because they envision that's a specialized area and we don't take care of that. Somebody else does that. This is a problem for birth too, for pregnant people who are birthing. Often they aren't well supported because the perception is that, well, the healthcare medical people will take care of that, but they're usually busy, dealing with real big crises in some cases, life-threatening emergency, broken limbs, etc. And so it is important, I think, to be aware of that gap, that you're only one family or one human with this tiny person you're responsible for, and you're gonna have to go to 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 different places to get all your needs met. We're not going to talk about this now, but in the next session, I'll talk about one of the things we did to try to address that problem in how we created a different model in the emergency social services system in Fort McMurray. But I think that's really important. And Adele, also, a lot of people have medication needs. People leave without their medications. That's a big need. There's pharmacists come and there's supplies there. And it's really difficult, I think, sometimes to get even just all of your lactation health needs met within this system. You might have needs for supplies. You might need a private place might need electricity for a breast pump. You might also be experiencing mastitis, so you might need a healthcare need, and then you might also have a feeding need to be addressed. You have an infant who's not able to latch in this moment that needs to be fed, and that's a complex scenario. And in an emergency, that's often a number of different places that people are kind of forced to try to go to get this one problem that they have, which is, I have a baby that doesn't latch, I have a pump that doesn't work, and I am feeling very ill and I have a fever and probably need antibiotics.
Thank you for giving that additional detail, Jodine. So we are past time, so if anybody doesn't have any other urgent questions, I want to thank both of you, Norma and especially Jodine, for joining us today. And we will go ahead and make sure that we share the contact information for Safely Fed Canada so that people can reach out to you. And we look forward to having you back in session 10, where we can talk more about all of the preparation side of things and how to implement these things before the disaster occurs. So thank you so much, Jodine and Norma.